everyone ready?
Yes.
Judge, you ready as well? Perfect. For over 700,000 American citizens living in the District of Columbia, the foundational principle of democracy, no taxation without representation, remains an unfulfilled promise. These residents pay federal taxes, serve in the military, and contribute to the nation's economy, yet they are denied voting representation in Congress and lack full control over their own local government. This is a fundamental injustice. Granting statehood to D.C. is not only a matter of fairness, it is a constitutional and moral imperative. That is why Larson and I are proud to affirm, resolve, Washington, D.C. should be granted statehood. On framework, in an era of misrepresentation and constitutional rights violations, Washington, D.C. citizens are being denied their full rights. If this continues, we risk underrepresentative legislation and unfair resource distribution in a politically and economically unstable city. The affirmative will demonstrate why statehood is crucial for D.C. citizens' well-being, while the negative has to prove that these constitutional injustices cannot under any circumstance be solved by statehood, in addition to providing solvency within their case. Roadmap. Contention 1 is self-determination for D.C. citizens, and contention 2 is power lies in the Senate. Contention 1. Granting D.C. statehood would allow D.C. citizens to have representatives with voting power in Congress. Currently, D.C. citizens do not have any accurate representation, as according to Ellis 2024, Washington, D.C. has a non-voting member in the House of Representatives. This lack of representation has allowed Congress to deprioritize D.C. issues that are put on the floor. For example, the bill for D.C. statehood that was passed in the House but not in the Senate. According to Nagel 2013, vetoing D.C. laws is not the only way in which Congress may direct D.C. policy. Congress can and often does simply block D.C. from spending funds on particular issues, and thereby renders D.C. laws useless without actually overturning them. D.C. statehood would force them to have one representative in the House and two senators. As according to McAllister 2021, they would elect 2 senators and at least 1 representative to the House of Representatives, giving them equitable representation in both houses of Congress. In addition, legislative enactments would no longer be subject to congressional review. The impact is legitimacy and fairness. D.C. citizens will have complete control over creating legislation based on their own interests, increasing their trust and legitimacy in the government. Every D.C. citizen should be afforded the rights of all U.S. citizens that can vote for representatives to create their local and regional legislation. This will lead to not only a higher satisfaction rate in the government, but also equality among citizens' rights. Subpoint B is statehood denied is justice delayed. Many arguments made against statehood for Washington, D.C. are rooted in racism and anti-black sentiment. Washington, D.C. is a majority-minority city, meaning the majority of residents are black, as according to Bowman Posing, 47% of the population in D.C. is black. Denying statehood to D.C. and representation for its citizens is denying black people's rights from not only being represented, but also from being valued. The impact is proportional representation in a reformed criminal justice system. There is an extreme and disproportionate amount of representation for the black population, as according to Williams, if made a state, D.C. would have the highest proportion of black residents of any state and help correct the underrepresentation of voters of color in the American political system. By recognizing D.C. residents to have self-governance and federal voting representation, Congress would be correcting a historic harm that is rooted in anti-blackness and perpetuates racial inequity. As according to Bowman Posing, this diversity could also spur political innovation, as the multicultural composition of D.C. would allow for the emergence of state-level legislation and policy innovations responsive to the need of a racially diverse constituency. Not only would D.C. statehood grant minorities a step towards proportional representation in the federal government, but it could also reverse some racist laws that have led to the unproportional imprisonment and racial bias within the justice system, which we will expand more on in the second speech. Subpoint C is political pawns. Aside from just Congress being able to deny funding and deprioritize D.C. laws, they are also able to directly interfere and veto laws that are in the interest of Washington, D.C. As according to Hollis 2024, there are multiple examples of the federal government interfering with D.C. governance, which include but are not limited to restricting funding for abortion, taking control of D.C.'s deficit, and blocking the council's move to rewrite the criminal code. Washington, D.C. has been used as political pawns for the federal government and is becoming increasingly imminent that we fix it currently. Donald Trump said in February that we should govern D.C. I think the federal government should really take it over D.C. governance and run it really properly. Congress has the power to veto any law that is proposed and vote unanimously by Washington, D.C. officials, and they're currently being political pawns and being told what to do by the federal government. Statehood would provide D.C. the opportunity to have full oversight and sovereignty over their state laws with no interference or oversight from Congress. As the presidential administration is starting to remove home rule, is an incredibly important time to provide the certain permanence that statehood provides to protecting D.C.'s sovereignty. The impact is abortion. Not only has Congress vetoed laws about the criminal code or taking control of D.C.'s deficit, but it's also decreased funding for abortion while Washington, D.C. people and authorities are in support of it. For example, Congress has opposed the Dorman Amendment on D.C. that restricts D.C. from using locally raised tax dollars to pay for abortion care through Medicaid, as many states choose to do with their locally raised funds. For many low-income Washingtonians, the Dorman Amendment makes legal, essential health care inaccessible. D.C. citizens citizens should have the right to decide their reproductive laws and funding measures based solely on their own interests, not allowing congressmen from other states to decide. Contention 2, power of the Senate is the power of the people. Senators are essential to representation. All bills that are passed through the House must be approved by the Senate, meaning having a representative in the House of Representatives is important, but without accurate representation in the Senate can be insufficient. Creating 2 senators from Washington, D.C. is essential to allow each citizen to exercise their citizenship-given rights. Subpoint B is racial representation. The black vote only has a 75% weight in comparison to the white vote, leading to an unrepresentative and unproportional Senate. Having 2 senators from a majority-minority city will take steps towards increasing that percentage and making the federal government more representative as a whole. My partner will elaborate on this in his speech. And subpoint C is moderating the Senate. Currently, many close votes are controversial, mostly extremist topics are decided with a 51-50 vote. For example, the United States approved Pete Hegseth, President Donald Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense, on a mostly party-line 51-50 vote. This statehood would also allow them to moderate the Senate by guaranteeing 2 Democratic seats, which would change the majority to be 52 votes, incentivizing nominations and bills to appeal to a more moderate, less extremist view in order to be passed. This could also counteract Republican gerrymandering efforts in the South that dilutes Democratic representation. For these reasons, me and Larson are proud to affirm the resolution.
Okay, are you good for cross?
Yes.
I'll start on your sort of self-determination contention. Start on like the racism point.
Yeah.
How does statehood resolve all of the impacts of racism in the district?
So we're not necessarily arguing that it's going to solve for every single thing, but what we're saying is that the black population within Washington, D.C. is being extremely silenced right now, and the
How
way
so?
Because they don't have any representation within Congress.
Why is a congressional representative key to like stopping silencing of black voices? They already have electoral votes, they vote for president. Why is a congressional representative key?
Because a lot of legislation that has racial bias undertones is made throughout the Constitution. If you don't have made throughout Congress, if you don't have representation within Congress, you're not only denying the specific citizens of D.C. from having a representative and weightful voice, but also on a more federal level, they're extremely underrepresented, and then just would fix the proportionality.
So how does adding like 1 seat in the House and 2 seats in the Senate actually resolve any sort of racial impacts? Because Republicans will still have the majority post statehood.
Yeah, so what we're saying is that their current, black people's current percentage of weight that their vote has is only 75% to the white vote. Any type of step towards the proportionality of that, making that percentage higher, would be beneficial towards representing black people.
Even
if
it doesn't lead to any tangible legislative change?
Well, it does relate to any tangible legislative change, as the government is currently extremely polarized, and many controversial extremist decisions are made on a 51-50 vote. We bring you up an example within case. That what we're saying is that when you add senators, that a lot of these really controversial close votes would essentially be moved.
Okay, can you give me an example of a policy that Congress blocked that is was intended to correct racial injustice in DC?
What? Wait, say that again?
Okay, so you talk about how Congress is blocking policies from being passed to promote racial justice in DC. Name one.
Yeah, so this is more in regards to our criminal justice point, which my partner will expand on in our second speech. But essentially, there's a lot of things that are done within the federal government's oversight of the criminal justice system that have led to mass incarceration rates, especially of black constituents, which we will prove to you can be solved within statehood.
How does statehood for Washington, D.C. resolve criminal injustice across the country?
It's not across the country, it's just within DC. As the framework we said, it is dependent on what DC's citizens' well-being is.
Cool, so what percent of people in DC, prisons, compared to the rest of the country are jailed unjustly? What's the percentage difference there?
I don't have the exact percentage.
Okay, so you can only solve for, impacts within the district, and you cannot solve for any of the racial injustice, criminal justice system injustices throughout the country, correct?
Well, what we're arguing for on the federal level is the proportionality of black people's weight, or the black vote weight in Congress versus the white people's vote. We're not arguing for criminal justice reform nationally. We're arguing for criminal justice reform within DC, but we'll get into that.
Okay, so what is the tangible legislative impact of increasing that proportion? I don't think you've said it.
Of increasing that proportion?
Yeah, what's the
I have said it. There's a lot of extremist votes that are made on a 51-50 decision that once you have those 2 senators would be changed.
Even though Republicans will still have a majority in the House and Senate?
We're also saying long term this representation is going to be important for right now. DC citizens don't have any access to any type of representation. That is not only extremely unconstitutional, but it's just unfair that these citizens do not have representation in comparison to all other citizens within the United States that have equal access to representation in the House and in the Senate. When you don't have that, you're giving these people experience to ballot exhaustion and not allowing their voices to be heard.
Sure. Have we seen ballot exhaustion in DC?
Well, there's no vote, so that. There's no.
In terms of like other political examples, like they vote for president, have we seen ballot exhaustion there because they don't have congressional representation?
I'm not arguing on what happened in the past. I'm arguing that if you do not have like if you do not have representation, like they have no way of exercising their citizenship given rights of exercising their.
Contention 2, you talked about how Senate representation is specifically key. What was the warrant for that? I don't think I caught it.
The warrant for that was that you need to increase racial representation proportion. It would moderate the Senate, and that most of the important decisions are made within the Senate.
Okay, sure.
Is my judge ready? And are my opponents ready?
Yes.
Great. All right. So I have 6 minutes on the clock, and I'm going to start now. So hello, we are standing in for negation of the resolution. Washington, D.C. should be granted statehood. The affirmative advocacy is not feasible. It's dangerous to the delicate political balance of America, and it violates the intent of the framers and Constitution. As the negation will demonstrate the unique harms of the affirmative advocacy and why you should vote for a negative ballot. So our first argument is a counter-advocacy. Right now, it is far more critical to preserve the rights of D.C. citizens by retroceding the territory to Maryland. In the current political climate, quick secessions back to Maryland may be needed to preserve civil rights for D.C.'s residents rather than lengthy states of battles. According to Elena Schneider, established journalist as of 2025, to protect D.C., it might be necessary to eliminate D.C. and merge it into Maryland because of dramatic political reversals in the age of Trump. Trump is mused about a takeover and sought to end local government altogether. In this environment, no one is taking seriously about statehood, but alarm over democracy and self-government has spurred a conversation about returning the federal city to Maryland. The current issue of crisis is such that one of the House's foremost D.C. supporters recently shocked the local establishment by pronouncing himself a retrocession friendly. It's about services, not symbolism. Would you rather live in a judiciary based on the population only a bit larger than tiny Vermont, or join a decently sized state that does stuff well already? Of course, Maryland would benefit from D.C. taxpayers as well, who are very well off, contributing to the Maryland economy. Our next argument is that if D.C. were to be admitted as a state, upsetting the balance of Republican and Democratic power in the Senate, Texas is in a unique position to overcorrect by splitting into multiple states. Believe it or not, Judge, Texas doesn't need congressional approval to split into a group of new states. According to Eric Trickney, a writer and journalist as of 2017, Texas state legislator in 1932 argued that Texas could split itself into 5 states. Quote, an area twice as large and rapidly becoming as populous as New England should have at least 10 senators. The state could actually split any time without any action from Congress, a power no other state has. Dividing Texas into many little Texases survives today as a quirk in American law. Quote, we're the only state that can divide ourselves without anybody's permission, says author. Texas's claim to an exception comes straight from an 1845 joint congressional resolution admitting Texas into the Union. Quote, new states of convenient size not exceeding 4 in number in addition to said state of Texas and having sufficient population may hereafter by the consent of said state be formed out of the territory thereof, which shall be entitled to admission under the provisions of the federal constitution. Congress pre-approved a breakup, and they've already begun posturing about a split, specifically in the case of a constitutional change. Drew Wood, writer and journalist, wrote in 2025 that what would it take for Texas to go to a third attempt at independence? Texas might be incensed enough at the federal government to try and secede if a leader tried to change or suspend the Constitution, which is the affirmative advocacy. Politics in our country have not been so polarized since the Civil War. Political deadlock, economic collapse could all be catalysts, and it wouldn't be surprising if Texas would lead the way. Our third argument is if D.C. were to be admitted as a state, Trump would surely see it as a personal attack on his rhetoric and legacy, leading him to retaliate. Trump, as we all know, has been calling for a total federal takeover of D.C. He wants complete control over as much territory, and he wants to be the one to broker the deal. Andrea Shalal, journalist for Reuters, wrote in 2025 that Trump threw his support behind calls for federal government takeover of Washington, saying the local government was, quote, not doing the job. I think we should take over Washington, D.C., said Trump, who has made similar calls in the past. And the latest Republican threat of a takeover is the most serious to date. Now, Trump has already said he wants Canada to be the 51st state, so admitting D.C. against his wishes threatens his rhetoric, his perceived control, and his legacy, which would embolden him to act. He desperately wants Canada, and all he needs is a push. According to Richard Murphy, as of 3/12/2025, Donald Trump wants it. He wants it because it's a rich source of supplies, and he wants to make it American because he wants to expand the empire. That's why people have always wanted to expand. The USA is trying to claim the power of Canada from its own people invest it into the billionaire class. There is therefore, in this threat to Canada, the whole question of the future and the way in which the world itself is going to be organized. And Trump trying to annex Canada would be catastrophic for both countries and the rest of the world. Aisha Ahmad, Associate Professor of Political Science, University of Toronto, 2011-2025, says that as Trump relentlessly threatens to annex Canada, an American invasion could one day become a reality. If Trump ever decides to use military force, the military invasion would trigger decades-long violent resistance, which would destroy the U.S. There's no leader willing to relinquish Canadian sovereignty over economic coercion, and so if the U.S. wanted to annex Canada, it would have to invade. And Americans becoming trapped by an insurgency would delight Moscow and Beijing, which could easily establish covert northern passages to send weapons to the insurgency. A chronic violent insurrection in North America would financially and militarily pin down the U.S. for decades, triggering economic and political collapse. Russia and China would enjoy the uncontested rise to power. Next, we believe that the framers of the Constitution created a federal district with a buffer zone for a reason, and it's critical to listen to the principles they designed. Federalist Papers argue that the federal government must be in a protected zone to limit the influence on and from nearby states. James Madison, Federalist number 43, writes about the ability to, quote, exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district by secession of particular states, indispensable necessity of complete authority as the seat of government. Without it, a dependence on members of the general government on the state comprehending the seat of government might bring on the national councils an imputation of our influence equally dishonorable to the government. And it's critical to listen to the framers because it's the only way to authentically operate the American machine they designed. According to Randy Barrett, the Constitution places limits, but these limits are a reflection of the majority will, the blueprint for the machine that was designed to perform a certain function. We cannot inspect every law individually and need some confidence that the internal operation of lawmaking process is designed to produce beneficial laws and weed out the others. And finally, if you're not convinced, it's actually fiscally impossible for DC to function autonomously. They cannot function autonomously as a state. According to David Schleicher, professor of law at Yale Law School, writes that the district has all sorts of responsibilities, state-like services that would cost $1.1 billion annually, and traditionally they're offset by an annual payment by the federal government. However, many such special spending obligations still remain in place, and at the same time, DC faces limits on its ability to raise revenue. Every state that taxes income includes a tax for non-residents who work in the state, but this limit costs the district government $1.4 billion annually because a huge amount of the non-taxable property in the district, which is 42% of the total property wealth of the city, cannot be taxed.
Is everyone ready for calls?
Yes.
Good? Okay. So, if retrocession is such a good option, why have DC residents repeatedly rejected it for over 100 years?
Because nothing has been the same political climate that we have now, which you as a affirmative have actually said in your first speech. The political climate now is different in the past 100 years.
Okay. Is it more democratic to grant full autonomy to DC residents or to fold them into a state that they do not want to be a part of?
Well, as we've proven right now, in the current status quo, which is what we're debating, DC cannot actually become a state fiscally. They don't actually have that fiscal capacity. They don't have enough revenue to generate.
Okay, so on that fiscal capacity, why exactly is the $1.1 billion upfront cost important when once DC is able to tax their non-resident income and certain areas of property tax, they would actually make $3.3 billion in revenue?
So they actually won't be able to because DC is still going to be filled with a lot of tax-exempt properties. So just because DC becomes a state doesn't mean that the federal government won't still have control over certain buildings in certain areas, as is the case with all other states that exist right now in the United States. And additionally, the point is that right now the federal government traditionally offsets the payment of that $1.1 billion that DC needs with their own funding from the federal government. So if DC becomes a state, they're not going to get as much money from the federal government because they're going to be there on the state.
That's fine. So one more time on your retrocession counterclaim. So how exactly would this transition, what would that look like?
The transition would be, they would be retroceding the territory into Maryland, and it's going to become part of Maryland. So
Legally, how would that happen? Like logistically?
Logistically or legally?
A bill by Congress.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so now let's talk about your Texas secession argument. So first, are you saying that Texas will secede or cities within Texas are going to secede?
No, so the way that it stands right now, when Texas actually was readmitted into the Union, there was actually a clause left in there that Texas can split into 5 states at any time. It's actually been pre-approved by Congress. So the argumentation here is essentially that if DC becomes a state, and as you said, maybe gains 1 or 2 of those extra seats in Congress, that Texas is then in retaliation, and they've actually said they're going to split into those 5 different states, which is going to actually boost up that Republican supermajority that they don't want.
Okay, and why have they not done that previously? If that's such an easy opportunity for them to gain more representation, what's been stopping them?
It's not that it's necessarily easy, but it's something that they're going to be willing to do if they feel as though that supermajority is threatened.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so onto your Canada argument. Could you explain to me just really quickly again what that is in regards to statehood?
Absolutely. So right now, Trump, as we all know, has said that he wants to admit Canada to be the 51st state. And being the 51st state is sort of the big deal. It's Trump, he's the one brokering the deal, he's the one who's bringing Canada into the fold, so to speak. However, if DC becomes a state, which is something that he's actively and publicly said that he's against, that goes against his authority. It goes his direct influence, it goes against his rhetoric. So then, because of that, he's going to be spurred into action and more likely to want to gain that territory, gain that influence, and regain that power. It's sort of like a responsive action.
Okay, perfect. And so why hasn't he done this before if he really wants Canada?
Because of all the harms that I outlined. But as we've seen,
And those harms go away and you're negative for them.
What do you mean?
Like those harms that are currently preventing him from taking Canada would disappear.
No, it's
in
more
your
that
network.
it's more likely that in a retaliatory measure he'd be spurred into action if he sees this massive slight against his political power. Like we've seen examples of him filing executive orders in direct response to things that judges have done, for example. It's not a new idea.
That's cool. And then your argument right after that is about the federal district. Can you explain to me again what that argument was?
What about it?
Like just give me a quick rundown.
On the framers?
Yeah.
So the framers of the Constitution, and it's written in the Constitution, that the District of the United States needs to be a district.
Yeah.
And in the Federalist Papers, they expanded upon that, the reasoning behind having that in the Constitution, which is that they want a buffer zone so that the district itself and the federal government of the United States isn't unduly influenced by a state that's right next to it.
Okay. It's over there first.
As my partner said, DC citizens are being denied their full rights. I'm going to extend upon this in the areas of criminal justice and racial representation and permanence, and then introduce a new contention about DC having access to more resources. But first, some rebuttal of the negative case. They brought up in cross what percentage of people in DC are unjustly incarcerated. Well, according to Broderick, as a direct result of the system applied, DC code offenders are more likely to serve time in higher security facilities where they are subjected to greater violence and have more rigorous constraints on their liberty. 39% of people convicted in DC offenses, 95.6% of whom are black, are incarcerated in high security facilities compared to 12% of the overall BOP population. I think it's fair to say that a larger percentage of these people would probably also be wrongly incarcerated if the prosecutors are going after them so vigorously that they're putting them in high security facilities at 4 times the normal rate. Now, onto the financial argument. We have 2 responses to this, right? So first, DC actually would make more than enough money as a state through taxes, according to Williams 2023. The revenue foregone each year because Congress denies DC full taxing authority of non-resident wages and salaries earned in the district is striking, nearly $3.2 billion annually. The fact that median earnings of non-DC residents is higher than the earnings of DC residents suggests that these revenue gains could be even greater than the estimates shown here. We could also utilize the unincorporated business tax to compensate for any loss of revenue, right? And so they would be able to use this money towards all the resources that they currently have their funding blocked for, like abortion or marijuana that my partner mentioned. Now, 2, even if you don't believe that the new tax revenue is going to fully cover the costs, with this vulnerability comes the ability to harness growth at a higher rate, right? A completely new regulatory landscape and a literal laboratory of democracy provide unprecedented opportunities for a business-friendly environment that we have not seen before. Schleicher, like they cited, also says, quote, there are a number of specific protections New Columbia could design to mitigate a boom-bust cycle. First, the fact that they would be able to take advantage of good times exposed to more risk and bad times counsels in favor of a constitutionally protected rainy day fund, which would skim 1% off their budget every single year, and they would probably be able to ensure that New Columbia could effectively weather downturns. So that effectively turns to us, right? Now, onto the capitulation argument, retaliation. I mean, this is not feasible, right? Should we just constantly capitulate to Trump? He's been annoyed plenty of times throughout his first and now second terms, and he hasn't invaded Canada yet. If Trump is so absolutely furious with DC and he's so easily set off, then we better guarantee its independence with permanence, which I will get into later. Now, finally, onto Texas secession. It's a highly open question whether this would even be legal, and it's probably not legal. In Texas v. White, 1869, by the Supreme Court, the court held that individual states could not unilaterally secede from the Union opinion, this would be a constitutional crisis and highly, highly unlikely, right? Now, additionally, on the federal district, this is absolutely not unique to DC statehood, and you still need a federal district in retrocession as well, right? They just have not proven uniqueness here. So, the extension of our first contention about proper representation, right? Criminal justice. According to Broderick 2024, district presidents have no vote and little say in the manner in which the district's criminal justice system is run. As a direct result of federal control, they experience one of the highest incarceration rates in the country, at a rate of 899 per 100,000 people. 95.7% of the residents are black or African American, while the population overall is 45% black. That is literally double. Some discrepancies within the justice system that have led to this are misrepresentative appointments to the Judicial Nomination Commission by opposing presidents, in addition to court vacancies from gridlock in the Senate with appointments, leading to, quote, delays in 200 cases per year, right? And these judges are not representing the values and priorities of district residents. Nevertheless, they are empowered to make critical decisions for decades, right? From pretrial release rulings, evidentiary trial matters, sentencing, resentencing, probation revocation, compassionate release. This is undemocratic, and statehood would allow black residents to gain proportional representation and have control over the judicial system that is currently wrongfully biased against them. Additionally, like the U.S. Attorney for D.C. is not appointed by or approved by D.C. in any way, doesn't even need to be affiliated with D.C. Look at the current D.C.'s AUSA, Ed Martin. He is openly hostile to the people of D.C., constantly issues unconstitutional threats, and has defended January 6th rioters. Additionally, like the D.C. criminal code revision was not even approved by Congress. So, how is this unique from retrocession? Retrocession would potentially be eliminating judgeships that would have been elected from D.C. normally, right? Local municipal state judges are generally elected by the residents of a state, and states get their own federal district courts with judges that their own senators blue slip or recommend. So their own judges, their own senators, these are both things that you do not access at all on retrocession. Now, onto race. Having two senators and a representative in the House is essential to balancing the white-black vote power in America, right? As my partner said, the average black American voting power is only 75% as much representation as the average white American in the Senate, and 55% of the Hispanic voter, right? So we're going to improve that percentage by having two senators, and this is good for trusted government and having more representative representation, right? Ultimately, this is a concrete step towards remedying injustice by ensuring that black voices have the full, guaranteed right to influence federal legislation. So finally, onto our contention 3 here, right? Access to resources. Granting DC statehood would give DC access to necessary resources that it cannot access right now and could not adequately access if it was retroceded, right? We know Congress enjoys plenary control over the district. They control every single little thing, right? So beyond the criminal justice self-determination that we just talked about, there are ramifications for security as well, right? They're the only state that cannot call upon, or the only National Guard territory with a National Guard that cannot call upon the National Guard by the mayor or the commander-in-chief, right? The president is the only commander-in-chief of the DC National Guard, which is a huge problem, right? Look at January 6th. They weren't able to call them up in time, and carnage, right? Speed and allocation was a problem as well during COVID-19. Maryland simply did not supply them with enough vaccines, right? And so how does statehood solve for this? Statehood allows for DC to have needed resources without being blocked by funding. Even if they were to retrocede, according to GW law professor Jonathan Turley, right, Democrats would seriously resent the balance of power shifting from Baltimore to DC. This is a clear motive to withhold funds or attempt to manipulate DC, right? Additionally, on our permanence point, Trump administration wants to remove home rule, allowing DC to govern their local affairs, right? What statehood does is it provides permanence, right? If we retroceded via legislation, this could be rolled back at any time, like in 1801 and 1874, and statehood is the only democratically acceptable political outcome. Thank you.
And I'm going to start it right now. So just to get into it as one prescription course, I just have a few questions. Starting right off the bat, you say that the money that's blocked right now, according to Williams 2023, can be used to cover costs, though maybe not all of them. So what's the definitive answer? Can it or can't it?
I think there's no reason to think that it could, that it couldn't, sorry. I mean, we haven't exactly seen how these new taxes will play out. It's impossible to say given the shifting nature of DC politics.
Okay, but you agree that the source we have specifically says that they wouldn't be able to make up the amount of money with the 42% of non-taxable property that they would need to make up for the fact that the federal government is no longer going to be supplementing this new DC state. Is that correct?
Are you referring to Schleicher?
Yes, I'm referring to my source at the end of our case.
Well, Schleicher actually argues that he cites a source that says it's actually unclear what the ultimate economic health of DC would be if it were to be granted statehood, and ultimately that we could mitigate this with other financial solutions like the rainy day fund.
Okay.
So I don't know that really controls here.
But if we're talking about, say, like right now, like what we can know right now, like of course in the future, maybe DC in 10 years might be able to, get funding from somewhere, but we're talking about right now. Like as it stands, the current laws.
As it stands right now, if they were to become a state.
Yes.
Right. They could implement non-resident wage taxes and unincorporated business taxes that would fix a large part of this revenue deficit.
A large
instantly.
part. A large part. Okay.
Maybe all.
So getting into it, you said that states cannot secede. Do you understand though that Texas isn't seceding and that they are, quote, entitled to admission under provisions of the federal constitution? That's part of their readmission into the union.
Yes, I understand that there's the provision in the Texas admission to the union that allows them to split into 5 states, but I understood you to be talking about actual secession from the
No.
union.
No. We are talking specifically about the fact that they are going to be 5 new states in total, which gives all of those states new representatives to Congress, which are obviously going to be Republican, and that creates an even bigger supermajority. We're not talking about secession.
I would push back against the premise that they're necessarily going to be Republican. If you look at the actual vote share in Texas, like if Austin, Houston, Dallas were to break off, like they would undoubtedly have at least some Democratic representation.
Okay, so maybe half and half.
Yeah, I think
Still keeps the
half and half,
supermajority
we're
though, right?
talking, I mean, half and half, we're talking basically status quo, so really no change here.
But the
right?
status quo is a supermajority. It's not actually half and half.
I don't think the status quo is a supermajority, it's a pretty narrow majority.
Right now, there is a supermajority in Congress and the executive branch. There's a Republican majority in all 3
That's
of
not
those
a
areas.
supermajority, that's a trifecta. A supermajority is 2/3.
Okay. We'll get into that. So another thing that you mentioned here is that there's going to be a cause of a constitutional crisis. What are you advocating for to make DC become a state? An amendment?
I think probably the most likely way to make this happen would be an amendment, but it's, again, open legal question could also probably be done via congressional legislation.
Okay, but you as the affirmative need to have an advocacy. So which are you advocating for?
We are advocating probably, I think, for a constitutional amendment that would.
Okay, so then if
eliminate-
you're advocating for a constitutional amendment, then how is that not gonna cause a constitutional crisis?
Because that is literally going through the prescribed amendment process in the Constitution.
Is that
It could
possible
not be
right
less
now?
of a crisis.
Is that possible right now?
I think we have enough fiat as the affirmative to say that yes, that is possible and it will happen. We're debating the ramifications here. It's a passive voice topic, right? Not the process.
Okay, but you are advocating for a constitutional amendment, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then just to get into a bit of what you were saying about your case, you said that the judges right now are empowered to make decisions over DC citizens and they're appointed by the federal government. Does DC have full local control over their own government structure, their police force, for example?
They have a large degree of it via home rule, but nowhere near enough, and Congress still has the final say. And additionally, we're going to have a constitutional amendment really just to fix the 23rd Amendment.
Okay, and what percentage of judges do you think act actively against the interests of DC citizens? You can answer that if you want.
Federal judges act against the interests of DC citizens?
The judges that you said were elected in DC that are actively going against the interests of citizens.
I think a large number that are appointed, not elected.
Of solvency, and then the counterplan, Texas split, and framers, and then the app case in order. We all good? Cool. Starting off, their advocacy they conceded in cross-ex was fiating a constitutional amendment. In order to make it work, they have to fiat that 38 states minimum say yes to amending the Constitution, but they don't have a solvency advocate that says that's even remotely likely. This is super problematic for their case for a couple of reasons. First, fiating state action at all is a problem. Becca Traber, a nationally recognized debate coach, political science, and legal scholar in 2018, writes that fiat is structured such that the negative debater is unable to question the likelihood of something happening as long as the apt debater defends the normal means of that thing happening. There's no real way to separate normal means passed of the policy and the effects of the policy. Insisting on fiat in all cases functionally means we cannot run arguments about politics outside the state without radically distorting the nature of that politics. Debaters assume that only pragmatic politics occur through the state. However, this is not the case. Things like feminist movements, intervention on norms of sexual harassment are examples of politics outside the state. And they have to fiat individually 38 states agreeing to this constitutional amendment. That's really bad. There's no point in legitimizing the idea of statehood when in the status quo there's not an actual path to make that happen. It's a reason to vote negative for 2 reasons. First, it's infinitely regressive. Debate sets a future precedent for future legal and government leaders. I bet the House and the fact that the majority of people at this tournament want to go into law or politics because of this. We need to use this tournament to set a precedent for those leaders. Allowing them to cop out with fiat sets the precedent for future leaders that they don't need to focus on real feasibility of their ideas only how they could maybe be good hypothetically if we do enough, sets a really bad precedent. And real world education, what they don't want you to know is that 3/4 of states agreeing to this amendment is literally impossible, if not really, really unlikely. It decreases in-round education because we don't get the experience in debating actual policy problems, or instead postulating about things that won't happen. And all of their solvency evidence and all of their advocacies is predicated not only on DC becoming a state, but them fundamentally changing all of their laws and taxation policies to raise enough money to actually become a state. Their advocacy is extra topical. You cannot say DC becomes a state and also they rechange all of their tax codes, so the 42% of property they can't tax, we can now tax. That is extra topical, unfair to the negative, and is an independent reason to vote for us. First, for relevant education, we expect to use debate rounds to learn about the topic. Then reading untopical advocacies like this destroys topic education by taking the discussion away from the topic. This is the only meaningful form of education at this tournament, because it is unique to these debates and this tournament. Absent clear topic lines, we might as well just go read Wikipedia at each other for a couple hours, because there's no reason to have a topic and no reason to have debates. We need to engage in learning about the resolution before the round to master the topic and have better debates, which would be more educational. They've prevented us from doing that by creating extra topical advocacy. Getting into the counterplan. They had no answer to the Maryland counterplan. It is the only way in the status quo not only to avoid Texas splitting into 5 different states, radically upsetting the balance of power in the Senate, but also is the best way to guarantee representation right now for Washington, D.C. citizens, because it is fundamentally impossible for D.C. to become a functioning state in the status quo once you sign your ballot. The only way to do that is to retrocede the territory into Maryland so that D.C. has some voting rights, some representation in Congress in the interim, and we can consider statehood at a future date when it's actually possible or actually likely. Next on the Texas split argument, they already talked about this a little bit in cross sets, but they answered a different argument in their speech. Specifically, Texas's state constitution says that they can split into 5 different states. Congress pre-approved breaking up. Texas is a super retaliatory state. They love their laws, they love being Republican, and at the end of the day, retaliating against DC becoming a state with 2 new senators for the Democratic Party is absolutely something in the question, particularly in the case of a constitutional amendment, because Texans love the Constitution and they don't want it to change. On to the, actually go to the Canada dissent really quick. Their only answer to this was like, nuh-uh, it's not gonna happen. Not a sufficient argument at the end of this debate. Trump has already shown that he is retaliatory in his policies, see everything he's done with all of his executive orders, and he's already stated that he wants Canada as the 51st state. Making DC the 51st state challenges his rhetoric, challenges his legacy, because he's no longer the president that brought in the 51st state. He's the president that was there when the 51st state was brought in, which challenges his rhetoric and leads him to retaliate, which would be massively impactful, not only for the country of the US, because we would have to invade Canada, but for Canada. It would cause massive devastation, lives lost, terrible war for both countries and the rest of the world. Moving on to the framers' contention, they don't answer this at all. Really, specifically, the framers of the Constitution wanted and required an insulated district with territory around it that was not a part of another state and that was not for another state, which is why it's so important to have DC as a locality and not as its own independent state so that the federal government stays insulated from politics. Going on to their case proper, we'll start on this sort of criminal justice argument. They have no evidence that statehood resolves criminal justice issues, particularly when DC would have to change its entire structure in order to actually resolve these criminal justice issues. Right now, even if they were to appoint other judges, there's no evidence provided by the affirmative that these judges would be significantly better or that better criminal justice reform policies are actually passed. They're postulating that all these things are going to happen, but don't have a solvency advocate and cannot tell you how it's actually going to happen. On this sort of the racial question, there's no tangible impact to increasing the percentage of the percentage power of black votes, particularly when, if we make DC a state, Texas gets 10 new Republican senators. That's a really big deal, and it means that nothing is actually going to happen tangibly on the racial justice issue, but they also can't tell you why it's such a problem in the status quo because there are no tangible policy impacts. Legislation is not being blocked by Congress because DC isn't creating or writing legislation to resolve this racial justice issue, meaning that even if we made DC a state, racism still happens not only in DC, but they can't resolve any of the impacts across the country, meaning that widespread racism still exists even if you wanted to vote out. At the end of the day, they've not given you a tangible advocacy or a reason why DC statehood is topical and possible, which is a detriment to their case. Let me get a drink real quick and then I'll leave it for cross.
So do you have any actual data on why Texas would automatically have 10 Republican senators?
I mean, I don't have a card that says that, but if Texas were to split into 5 different states, it is the likelihood that the majority of them would be Republican senators.
And I think your partner already conceded it would probably be a 50-50 split, which at most is a pretty minor impact in the grand scheme of things here, right? Can you also explain to me the exact link between DC specifically becoming a state and the United States invading Canada?
Yeah, sure. So specifically, Trump's rhetoric has been that he wants to bring Canada in as the 51st state, and we've already seen that he is really retaliatory in his policy when challenged on any rhetorical level or tangible level, but particularly a rhetorical level. Because of that, when we bring DC in as the 51st state, and it's not Trump's idea, it happens in spite of him, not because of him. His rhetoric is fundamentally challenged and fundamentally sort of like disregarded, not only by the country, but sort of by the world, and that leads him to retaliate by trying to annex Canada in a military fashion.
I do not think there is a realistic link here between DC becoming a state and Donald Trump wanting to invade Canada, which, to point out, Congress would have to actually declare war on Canada. Trump can't do this unilaterally to begin with. But back to
You
Texas.
say that, and yet
Back
he's
to
been
Texas
doing
real
unconstitutional
quickly.
laws
Why
in
has
Texas.
Texas not enacted this law yet? Why have they not actually split into these different states if they could have done this whole time? I mean, look at like Greg Abbott and filling the Rio Grande with barbed wire and buoys, right?
Yeah,
There's been
I've
plenty
answered
angry
this
before.
question when your partner asked too, but I'll answer it again. Specifically, Texas hasn't had a compelling reason to do that because it's obviously a process to split Texas into to a bunch of different states. We don't have this sort of fiat power that you do as the affirmative. So at the end of the day, it would take Texas time, effort, energy, money, etc. to split in 5 different states. But Texas, again, has a really retaliatory state government, which is why when we make DC a state and upset the balance of power in the country, they have an incentive to use this provision to split into different states. And they've already said that they are interested in doing that in the case of a constitutional change, which you've defended bath is.
Okay, so we've already gone into, you've explained the originalism, the original intent issues here. Do you really think that we should be, so why are the founders relevant here? First of all, authentically operating the machine. I mean, the machine is 250 years old and it's been amended a million times. Why do we care what they were thinking in 1789?
Yeah, sure. So specifically here, it's important to understand the intent behind the policy of DC statehood. So you say that the machine has operated for 250 years and it's been amended, which is true, but it's been amended in line with ideas that the framers upheld. As long as we keep the machine, or as long as we want to keep the machine, which is the country, active, we need to create policies, and our amendments need to be in line with the Constitution as it was originally written, as it was originally intended.
I mean, let's be honest, the point of amendments is to update the Constitution with the times. The 13th Amendment bans slavery. The Reconstruction Amendments control because they're the latest in time. Why are we letting white slaveholders from 250 years ago determine the autonomy of a majority black city?
Sure, so it's not that we're letting white slaveholders determine their autonomy, it's that when it comes to the American machine as they designed with the principles of liberty and justice for all, they had a different idea of that. We've updated the Constitution to be inclusive and to be more liberty and justice for all, which is not what this policy is, because an insulated district they've outlined as specifically necessary in the case of protecting the federal government from those types of politics.
Are core parts of liberty and justice not equal representation, your own representation, and freedom from tyranny?
Sure, those are true. However, there's no reason why creating the district as a brand new state, A, solves that, or B, is the best advocacy
I
in
mean,
this
it
debate.
literally does solve it. It guarantees them their autonomy from Congress, and it guarantees them equal representation represented in
If they
2
function as
senators
a state,
in
which we've
Congress.
already proven they're
I mean,
fiscally unable to.
I think we've
but
proven
okay.
at best the fiscal is a wash, and at best for you the fiscal is a wash, and at worst. Thank you.
All right. I'll take my 2 minutes to wrap. Sorry. roadmap is just going to be world v. world, framework, and then key issues. Is everyone ready? Okay. Judge, I will ask you one question. Do you believe Washington, D.C. citizens are worthy of constitutional rights? If so, you are voting in the affirmative. It is clear that Washington, D.C. residents do not have the representation they need in order to exercise their constitutionally given rights. This is why Larson and I are proud to affirm. Let's do a quick world v. world comparison. Even if you take the negative with their absolute best, you have misrepresentation because of voter dilution from the Maryland population and retaliation within the Maryland government, slow access to resources due to the need of Maryland approval, and horrendous criminal justice system with extreme backlogs and low representation for DC citizens. Even if you buy all those arguments, you still side with the affirmative because at our worst, we give you 2 senators, a permanence to the solution, and a quick turnaround to protect DC from Trump, and racial inequities that are made better through representation and the elimination of home rule. Framework. They did not prove that retrocession was unique to solving all of these impacts, and did not prove that statehood would not uniquely benefit the constituents of DC. Now let's talk about our key issues. 1, statehood denied is justice delayed. 2, power of the Senate is the power of the people. And 3, long-term impacts. But first, quickly on the topicality argument. This is a passive voice and not policy debate. It is civic debate. So we can say that the fiat of this constitutional amendment would happen, and we should say it should be a state, meaning that if you affirm, it will be a state, and that we say that even if you don't buy that we have this fiat, the wording of the resolution is should be a state. Therefore, we're having a values-based debate, not like a transition or like a logistics of how it would actually happen. We have fiat to say that it would happen. This is not a policy debate. We don't have to worry about topicality. All of our arguments are solely based on the values-based of the debate, not necessarily based on the logistics of how it would happen. But first, on race, we tell you that currently the black vote is only weighed at 75% in accordance to the white vote. They tell you that legislation is not being blocked by Congress, but this is not true because we give you 3 examples, Judge: abortion funding, deficit spending, and the criminal code that was interfered by the federal government. This criminal code is only a part of the argument made that our criminal justice system, which has not been responded to, is only going to be able to be fixed throughout statehood. We give you many links to how the criminal justice system is not representative of Washington, D.C. citizens, and the judgeships are appointed federally, leading to shady prosecutions and high incarceration rates. Currently, there are judge vacancies, the criminal code variations being overturned, and poor prosecution measures, which will only get worse if retroceded to Maryland. There are too many gray areas of what would happen to the federal circuit courts in Maryland. Judge vacancies would still exist, and many of the parts of the appellate court cases that are in D.C. currently would be transferred to the Maryland courts, increasing backlog and overall making it worse for DC citizens to gain criminal justice. Also, we tell you that it is necessary to have proportional representation in the Senate. With 2 more senators coming from a majority-minority city, DC would be the most diverse state in the nation. It could spur legal innovation for a more diverse state. Legal innovation is spurred within the state and then gone nationwide. This is how we make actual change and correct historic harms. This was not responded to. We also, they tell you that we don't give you examples of current legislation that isn't being passed, but we tell you that proportionality is what matters the most. Then they get on to us about this Texas argument that once we have 2 more Democratic senators, that Texas will want to secede. Couple responses. 1, we tell you why hasn't Texas done this before? If Texas is so power hungry, why have they not used this ability in the past? And 2, we tell you that it's actually still not even legally available because of a Supreme Court case in the 1986, which said that secession from Texas was never constitutionally a viable option and continues to not be. On representation, number 2, we tell you that retroceding is not democratic as the majority of citizens, not only within DC, but also Maryland, do not want to retrocede. 2, we tell you that the only way to gain this proper representation without the dilution of Maryland's votes being taken over for their senators and representatives, that it is unfair to not have representation for DC, and this can only happen throughout statehood. Statehood gives you unique access to 2 senators, which means that the place where it actually matters is having representation in the Senate. You can have representation in the House, you can have a representative, but without that final say in the Senate, you have no voice. It is essential that citizens of DC have equal rights as other citizens in any other state. This only happens through having 2 senators, and we just disproved their dissat to the senators argument, which is only about Texas secession, which can't happen legally or politically. Now, we also We also tell you that Maryland's government would actually be retaliatory if we read you a card about how they value Baltimore and Baltimore State, and we give you a certain example of COVID-19 when they were in charge of distributing vaccines to DC and give them an unproportional amount, giving their rural areas of Maryland even more vaccinations than for the 700,000 DC citizens. What's stopping them from doing this once they're retroceded to Maryland, and Maryland is now having to account for fiscally of all of DC? Now, on to our long-term impacts. Let's talk about this financial argument. We give you two solutions to the financial argument. One, that these federal funding would not just necessarily disappear and you would still have it. Two, that you have non-resident taxes, and they keep bringing up that a lot of the property taxes wouldn't be able to be done. However, that is just a federal oversight rule in the status quo that is not allowing them to have these unincorporated business taxes. In the affirmative, you will have these unincorporated business taxes, federal funding, and non-resident taxes, which we give you statistics which raise $3.3 billion in funding and lower the costs, which are an overestimation of $1.1 billion, in order to have a good amount of fiscal individuality. But even if you buy that, we argue that long term, it's more important that DC creates its own economy right now, because if you did have any type of retrocession or stay in the status quo, that funding from Maryland or from the federal government would just be extremely low, as the federal government is trying to cut $1 billion of funding to DC right now, and I've given you many cards of how Maryland would just retaliate and not give them enough funding. Now, finally, on their Canada argument, we tell you that if Trump really wanted to do this, he already would have done it. They give you no unique brink to statehood, and we tell you that the only way that you will gain representation, fix racism, and the criminal court system is if you affirm. Thank you.
Ready? Everyone's ready? Great. 6 minutes on the clock starting now. So to get right into it, I'm going to start off with this question of the topicality. So my opponent essentially says fiat's allowed, but even if you don't buy the fiat, this is a value-based round, and topicality doesn't matter. Judge, why have a topic? I ask you, why have a topic? Right now, as my partner stated, we need to be debating feasible ideas. We need to be talking about real-world education. We cannot be considering right now the fact that we can just magically make 38 states agree to something that is impossible, that right now in the status quo isn't going to happen. There are many other avenues at which the affirmative could have picked. As the affirmative actually suggested, there is an option option for congressional legislation, but they let that go. They agreed in their speech that they were pursuing a constitutional amendment. That's what the advocacy is. They can't say that they're fiating it. They can't say that they're picking legislation. Legislation is an option that they could have picked. They chose not to. Therefore, the affirmative loses on that case. Now, getting into a bit of what my opponent also spoke about, he said that right now, DC citizens deserve equal rights, and that there's low representation for DC citizens if they're absorbed into Maryland. But Judge, every single citizen has one vote. Regardless of if those DC citizens are absorbed into Maryland, they still have one vote. They're not second-class citizens, and right now, DC citizens actually have an electoral college, and they currently have the right to vote in a presidential election. Additionally, my opponent talks about these shady judges and prosecutions. There has been no direct link or solvency proving right now that DC has been stopped at all from fixing these criminal justice issues. They have not even provided you, Judge, one blocked bill or one blocked law by Congress prohibiting the DC local government, which is alive and well right now, from fixing these criminal justice issues. Don't buy that. Next, my opponent talks about secession of Texas isn't constitutional. I don't think that my opponents actually understand the terms of Texas readmission. Finally, my opponents talk about the federal funding issue, essentially saying if DC becomes a state, long term it's going to be more important that DC creates its own economy. Judge, we don't have a crystal ball. We're talking about what we can see, what we can hear, and what the experts are saying. And the experts are saying right now that the federal government is going to withdraw the funding that they're currently giving. So no, the federal government isn't going to just magically continue giving a lot of money to DC after it becomes a state. And that, as of right now, the way that the laws are, DC will not make enough money to actually be supported as a state. Now, getting into a bit of why you should feel confident voting for the negation today, I think the most important part of our advocacy is this Maryland counter advocacy, which solves every single thing that the affirmative has proposed to you. It solves the issue of equal representation by allowing these citizens to keep their one vote in presidential election and have representation in Congress. It actually allows for potential solvency for race issues as they're absolved into Maryland, although the affirmative has not proven why these citizens gaining statehood actually equals the fix on racial issues. And there is no potential Texas split or Canada disad. Now, getting into a bit more about this Maryland counter advocacy, it has been proven that in the political climate right now, that a quick secession back into Maryland is what's needed to preserve civil rights. The affirmative wants to tell you, Judge, that they care about the citizens of DC, that all they want is for the DC citizens to be protected, but that's not actually the case, because we as the negation are actually providing you with a counter advocacy that solves everything the affirmative does without any of the unique disadvantages of what the affirmative is proposing with a constitutional amendment, and yet they are completely blowing off this advocacy. And one other thing that I would like to point out that the affirmative said is that they talk about this idea of a constitutional crisis, and specifically with the Federalist 43 issue, they say, why do we care? Why do we care what the Federalist says? Well, it's ironic to me that the affirmative is saying on one hand that they care about, the Constitution and having a constitutional crisis, but at the same time, they're telling you, Judge, that they don't actually care what the framers said, and they don't actually care what the Constitution means to the United States of America. And furthermore, it is completely 100% possible that the Constitution can have modifications to it, etc. And yet the affirmative is the one saying that this constitutional amendment issue, that there's going to be a constitutional crisis if Texas decides to split into 5 states. Don't buy that. You can't buy on the one hand that Texas legally, without any constitutional issue, is going to split into 5 states, but at the same time, their advocacy to have a constitutional amendment is somehow going to be good. That actually doesn't make any sense. And now, the next thing that I'm going to bring up is this idea of the Texas split. They completely misrepresented this. They said that it's going to be Texas seceding. It's not Texas seceding. The argumentation here is that Texas, right now in the status quo, doesn't need congressional approval to split. Yes, Texas hasn't done that right now, but as both myself and my partner have explained now twice, the reason Texas hasn't done it is because of course it takes time, of course it takes resources, and yet, if you follow with the affirmative's advocacy and you make DC into a state, there is every single reason to believe that Trump is going to retaliate. And we quote here Drew Wood, the writer and journalist who directly links an amendment to the Constitution with Texas splitting. The fact that Texans are more likely to split into their 5 states, that option that they have when they were brought back into the Union, if there is a constitutional amendment, and that is directly the affirmative advocacy. That is the choice the affirmative made themselves. And finally, onto our Canada issue right here. We argued that if DC is admitted as a state, we are going to have massive turmoil in the right now. This is an issue that was not adequately addressed. The affirmative has not shown to you why, if DC is admitted as a state and Trump takes over Canada, which he is much more likely to do if his rhetoric, if his perceived control, and his legacy is undermined, as we've seen, he likes these retaliatory measures, they have not proven to you why those harms will not happen. Thank you.